Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. And let me introduce you to our four panelists that we have for today. We have Mr. Viola Weiss, who's the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Indiana Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel and the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Lawrence Parrish, who's the former Senior Counsel for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. And we have Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the Deputy General Counsel for the Seventh-day Adventist World Church. Gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to having a conversation today that hopefully everyone will enjoy. You know, there's been a very interesting situation with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a group that's sometimes called the LDS and sometimes even called the Mormons. They have found themselves in a situation where they have been hit with a fraudulent case where someone has basically taken away almost $500 million from parishioners. One of the interesting things that we are starting to see in our society is that individuals who are going out and going after individuals in terms of trying to get in, whether it be fraud of some sort or some type of Ponzi scheme, they are targeting individuals who are members of church. You know, federal investigators have accused Michael Beasley and also Jeffrey Judd and some other individuals for targeting the LDS Church in what is now being called the Mormon Ponzi scheme. I was unbelievably shocked to find out that there are more Ponzi schemes that are being perpetrated in Utah per square mile than anywhere else in the United States. But when you start to take a look at some of the matters that are out there that the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and others have to get involved in, we're starting to see that people of faith are being targeted because the understanding is they are so trusting and they are so loving that they are now finding themselves losing billions of dollars every year. You know, Andre, this is something that I find to be very interesting, that even when you think about things, for example, a case I worked on regarding the Madoff situation where he was targeting those who were from the Jewish faith, and we see this situation some ways targeting the Ponzi's. A few years ago, I saw something in Maryland where they were targeting these churches in which they had predominantly African members. Where are we going, and how do we find ourselves to really protect individuals, especially when you have the government that doesn't spend a whole lot of time in churches? And somehow we've got to protect parishioners, but I'm unclear as to how we can go about it.
Yeah, this really illustrates that churches are truly communities, and close-knit communities at that. Families worship together, socialize together, their children grow up together as if they're siblings. And inherent in that is a sense of family and trust. And so it's really incumbent upon the church leaders to be vigilant about what happens in their church families. That kind of situation is almost the perfect ecosystem to execute a predatory scheme like this. I mean, it's bad enough when it's a parishioner or a church member driving the scheme, but when it's a church leader or done with the knowledge of a church leader, that's an entirely different level of depravity, in my opinion.
Now, Mr. Parrish, you've seen this lots of times at the SEC and even had to go after some of these pastors engaged in these activities. You know, how's the SEC dealing with this, and how are they figuring out ways to connect with church members?
Well, first, let me say thank you for having me, Orland. And I totally agree with everything your guest panelist Andre just said. The SEC has for years going after these perpetrators that tried to come to parishioners of the different religious institutions, preying upon them, as Andre said, utilizing what we call affinity fraud. You know, it could be, as Andre said, the community ties, but with the church, it's the fact that we all are under the same religious belief. And these fraudsters prey upon the fact that generally most religious individuals are taught from their governing body to be kind, warm-hearted, and these fraudsters take advantage of that. So what we found in the numerous cases that I worked on, that the parishioners they tend to look up and respect the leaders of their institutions. And so they don't really take the safeguarding posture of ensuring that they're doing their due diligence, where you would have done some on the outside. But because these individuals, they're leaders of your church, they may be deacons or the trustees. And in a lot of these cases, what you'll find is that the actual fraudster will actually bring in the leaders of the church, and they may not be willing participants of the fraudulent conduct, because they themselves were duped to believe that this the possibility of investing in this venture that was presented to them seemed to be on the straight and narrow. And they're able to perpetrate this fraud in numerous cases. In the case where you were talking about in Utah, what you found is that a lot of the leaders themselves were actually, they received these outrageous returns that were presented to them. And I think in Utah, they actually promised them a 50% annual return on their investment, which, anyone would say 50% return, that sounds too good. And as the saying goes, if it's too good to be true, in most cases it is. So when you find these parishioners and other members of the church, not doing the research they may need to take, what I think these regulated bodies, including SEC and other state and local authorities, need to do is a better job of educating the churches and other religious institutions on how to protect their congregation from these individuals.
Todd, you're somebody who's out there seeing a lot of pastors and leadership. And, how are we helping to advise in some way, being cautious who you bring in the church, who you associate your name with? I mean, we start to see these fraudulent activities almost taking place in some religions at the very, very top, working its way all down into the pews. How have you been able to kind of help to assist to hopefully keep some people on the right side of these issues?
Well, we certainly have policies about who can address the congregation, who can preach. And I think overall, the best policy for a church to have is that financial propositions or financial presentations, as far as for specific products, should never be given. I mean, even if it was a Merrill Lynch representative, right, talking about their latest index funds, there's really, in my view, isn't a whole lot of reason to have that kind of a presentation or a sales pitch in a church setting. It's fine to talk about, fiscal responsibility, talk about stewardship, and talking about like investment principles, but there really should not room and shouldn't be room for the sales of financial products, even legitimate financial products. And pastors certainly should not be using their position as far as getting sort of kickbacks or rewards or something else in that. And I'm not saying this Adventist church has been perfect on that. For the most part, our leadership and our pastors have not gotten involved in that. And, I think that just is something we got to be diligent on. And quite frankly, it takes parishioners and others to bring this to people's attention. But oftentimes people just see these returns. A lot of people are not particularly financially sophisticated. That while there's information out there that can often be very, very hard to access. I mean, the SEC does a good job of making regulatory requirements, but quite frankly, a prospectus is not a comprehensible document to most people. And the SEC has done a good job of making sure that people put the information out there, but has not done a good job of making it understandable by your lay people. And so I think all of those kind of combine together, and then also just quite frankly, greed. People like to make money.
But Vilo, when you have a lot of these churches, many of them are small, where they're really like family, and sometimes somebody wants to know, how should I be using my money? Who do I call when somebody has passed away? I don't understand this insurance aspect. I don't understand what I could be doing. Sometimes the family conversations in church can lead to something like this, but sometimes churches, it is their responsibility to kind of help their parishioners. How do we find the line or the balance here to make sure we don't go in the wrong direction?
It's natural to turn to people that and as Andre mentioned, the people are they grow up together, the kids are together, and so it's easy to trust people, particularly people that have been wealthy and successful. But but we need to draw the line when it starts getting excessive. In fact, I did a little bit of research, and I found that the general handbook for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints warns against fraud. And it says a member involved in fraud could jeopardize their membership. And so we need to let people know that big rates of return are on their face suspicious, and we should look at that with a jaundiced eye.
Larry, I know you had to actually deal with pastors, and there were some pastors who many people were connecting as being part of this, affinity fraud. Is there anything that the SEC is doing in even letting pastors maybe know that, listen, if you're affiliated in any way, you may have thought you had no intent, but the fact that they're relying on you, that's already a problem for you?
Well, Orland, I would tell you that in the past, the SEC has reached out to a number of churches offering them educational material in trying to get the parishioners or congregation to attend and to distribute that type of information. The SEC has a website where we gear people to if they have any questions about the person that they may be dealing with, as well as FINRA, which actually is, they have a website where you can check investment advisors to see if they have any prior disciplinary record and history. But I think, as one of your other panelists indicated, I think that we have to do a better job in the churches to make sure that we're educating our congregation to look out for certain fraudulent activities and red flags. As I mentioned earlier, that a lot of times these pastors and leaders of the church, they are scammed themselves, and then they go to their membership and they're advocating on the behalf of the fraudster that, look, see what I've gotten, look at the returns. And they see, you got to remember in some churches, prosperity is something that they teach that is, a kind of a reward or award to you. And so, a lot of members are, they're enticed by that. And hey, if my pastor, who's the leader of my church, he's invested in this and he's gotten a great return, they seem to be blinded to all the other red flags that may be occurring, that there's no transparency in the deal that they're offering them, that this rate of return is really outrageous, but they're, again, they don't see that because they put their faith in the people who are presenting to them this deal. And in a lot of cases, like I indicated, the pastors or the deacons or the trustees, they themselves were duped, but they received a good return, and these fraudsters tend to use them as the go-between.
Yep. Yeah, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, Larry. But, it's funny that our money says, in God we trust. And it sounds like that should be the only entity that we trust in. And as somebody who had been, working on the Ponzi scheme regarding Madoff, I was shocked to see the number of people who came to me and said, the reason we got caught in this is because we believe that God sent this person in our lives to make our lives better. So go figure. This is some of the things we're going to be dealing with going forward. We're starting to see as the Supreme Court has different kinds of cases. There's one case that's called Burkeen versus Harlan, which recently there was basically at stake interested parties that were dealing with the old Indian Child Welfare Act, considered by many to be the gold standard of child welfare policies. It was passed all the way back in 1978, and it was supposed to be a means to stop Native American families from being separated by state child welfare agencies and private adoption services and basically seeking placement in a completely different way. This case turned out to be something in which the New York Times ended up picking it up. They started engaging in what some simply called the Solomonic fight over the fate of children. And seeing exactly where some of these things are supposed to go has been a bit of a confusion as to how do you end up protecting the interests of one side, but then allowing one's religious beliefs to be flourishing in some way. Vilo, I know you've seen some of these cases, and as someone who has spent a lot of time, for example, in states like Oklahoma, where you're starting to see a lot of issues still that exist as it relates to Native Americans, could you give us a little bit more color in this particular case here and how you think we actually got to the point where we are?
I think one of the fundamental problems we have in cases like this is that kids are taken from their family of origin and put with foster parents, and that's not a bad thing. But the thing that I think that needs to happen is we need more Native American foster parents, and because once a child gets into a home and relationships grow, and then mom and dad start thinking, well, could we adopt this child?
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular case, the couple involved here, they already have adopted the brother who has the same birth mother, and so we need more Native American foster care, and I think it could head this off, and that way they could be raised more in a climate and a culture that's tribal and would create less problems going forward.
Hey, Todd, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I agree completely with that statement that is one of the solutions to this. I also think there's room for better education. I mean, it seems like in all of these circumstances, you have state courts either didn't follow the law or didn't have jurisdiction, but they thought they had jurisdiction. And, family law, not to speak disparagingly of family law judges and attorneys, but it's not the most rigorous of the areas of law, right? It's best interest of the children. It's very sort of soft, sort of considerations. And these, this isn't a lot of detailed statutory interpretation. So I think there's work to be done there. But, ultimately the question here is whether or not this particular law is constitutional or whether it violates the equal protection law.
Mm-hmm.
And, the tribes say, no, this is political distinctions, not racial distinctions. The state of Texas and these parents say, no, these are racial distinctions. And there are some problems with the arguments the tribes are making. So one of the questions here is sort of called the third preference. So the first preference is an extended family member, which, by the way, is true almost in all foster care situations. But then there's also a preference for any other Native family. Any other Native family. So the bill treats Natives as fungible. It just doesn't matter if you're of a different tribe or a different background, a different culture. They all have preference over non-Native populations. And also it doesn't matter if the child is a member of the tribe or not. And I think all of those really kind of cut against the idea that this is more political distinctions than it is really racial distinctions. And I would also point out that in other contexts, tribes would certainly consider themselves to be a racial, have racial identity or racial protections, as far as the 14th Amendment goes. So, I think the Supreme Court has a tough road ahead. Justice Scalia, when he was still alive, was asked what the toughest case for him was, just personally, to make a decision. And he cited a Native American adoption case as the toughest case he had ever had. So, while I do have certain views on this, anyone who thinks this issue is easy, I just don't think has looked at it enough.
Andre, give me your thoughts on this as to where we think we should be going as it relates to these type of topics.
It's funny that Todd and I were just conferring on a separate Domrel case, and we both said, family law, domestic relations is an area of law that neither of us will touch because it's just so fraught with high emotion and complicated situations, and in this particular situation, you have another court involved. You have a tribal court. And really, when you look at ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, it really brings back the fundamental standards that's found in any family law domestic relations statute, and is who's the psychological parent of the child, and then ultimately what is in the best interest of the child. And so those are the two issues that are driving this. Whether it be in state court or under ICWA. Those interests is what's going to be driving the outcome of this case. So, we have two parties here that want to adopt this little girl, and really it doesn't come down to the merits of either one, but really who does the child identify with psychologically as a parent, and what's ultimately in the best interest of that child.
Well, Vilo, how do we end up handling a situation? I mean, what they really ended up doing, which I don't know how this is in the best interest of the child, they pretty much kind of split her into, you're going to be with this group sometime, you're going to be with the other group sometime. And I think one of the things that we've always talked about as being important to children is consistency in some way. You know, this whole idea of this, Solomonic view on this as being this might be the best way to go. I can't imagine as we move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction that this will continue to be in place.
Yeah, it is a concern to me too, because the issue with, each tribe has their own culture, and the children, if at all possible, I think should stay within that culture. And to suggest, well, if you don't have anybody, say in the Cherokee Nation or the Potawatomi Nation that is a foster parent, to take a child in, will go to another tribe. But Native American culture is very, very deep and very strong, and it's been disrespected in this in the provisions here, and I think that's a problem, and maybe we can head down a road to where we fix that so that they can keep they maintain their cultural identity. I've noticed, living in Oklahoma as I did for many years, we saw more and more Native Americans wanting to resurrect their language and learn their language, where many of them were not fluent in their languages. And so it's good to see a renaissance of this, and we need to see a renaissance in protecting the kids from these respective tribes as well.
Well, Todd, you mentioned Justice Scalia and that having to deal with something like this was one of his toughest issues. How did he end up handling it when it finally came in front of him? I mean, what ended up happening in that situation?
So in that particular situation, this is what made it kind of tough for Justice Scalia, was that the parents that, it was twins, about 3 years old when the case got to the court, were clearly in the best circumstance. But the law, at least in Scalia's view, was that the case had to go back for the tribe to make the decision. And that's in fact what happened. It went back to the tribe to make the decision. I guess the kind of happy ending to that outcome was that the tribal courts decided to leave the children with the adoptive parents, but then ordered some level of sort of connection to be continued with the tribe moving forward. Wasn't really able to find anything. That's been a number of years ago. I don't know if any articles have been done, but that was the outcome there. The challenge in this particular case is, if the Equal Protection Clause kicks in for distinctions made with natives, that can have an impact in a number of other areas where Indian country is given sort of preferences and other types of benefits the federal government gives. There's also a bunch of case law where Congress has plenary authority over Indian issues, and so it is a difficult issue to have. But on the other hand, this pretty well is also making a racial distinction. In fact, courts have struck down preferences. If you have a Black child, they're not allowed under the Constitution to take the race of the parents in consideration, or the would-be foster parents or adoptive parents into consideration. They can take family into consideration, but not race. And we've made that decision, just simply saying that any benefits that might have there, we still have our Constitution, and we're not going to ignore that. And so, the Supreme Court, which heard arguments about this in the fall, is going to have its work cut out for it.
Andre, I got to just kind of end with you on this. We look at these type of cases, and the real question that comes up is, are we talking about culture? Are we talking about religion? Are we talking about a combination of both? Because on one hand, it's easy to look at something and say something is racial. But then we start looking at this when you start to bring in the concept of culture, and what aspect of culture that might be religion when your religion is part of your culture.
Yeah, if you look at the legislative intent of ICWA, the answer to the question is yes, all the above. I mean, our Native American history is steeped in culture and in its own community of values, and that's what that statute was designed to protect in the adoption context. And so that's there's the process is playing out the way it was supposed to be designed for this child to have and maintain his or her Native American identity. But now you have the family law standards of what's really ultimately in the best interest of the child. And if this, as this climbs the appellate ladder, I think that's the standard that's going to have to prevail.
Well, I got to make that be the last word, but you're right. As this actually finds itself going further and further up the chain from a legal perspective, we're going to have to really see what the decisions are, because it sounds like this is going to be an ongoing conversation, because we have yet as a country really come to a conclusion on how to handle issues of Native American from a cultural standpoint, religious standpoint, and all the other things that we have to deal with on a regular basis now. Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that 4,000 Cherokees lost their lives on the Trail of Tears coming to Oklahoma?
Wow, didn't know that was a number. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Carlos Ponzi, at the height of his pyramid scheme, no pun intended, was making $250,000 a day. And speaking of height, Ponzi was only 5'2".
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Prior to the Madoff investment scheme and pyramid scheme collapsing, the SEC wasn't even aware that he offered investment opportunities to people. They only found that out after the investigation started.
Crazy. Larry, tell me something I don't know.
That there has been a total of almost $50 billion globally has been assessed to Ponzi schemes and other fraudulent actions taken against churches and other institutions.
Wow, it's a big number. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate having a conversation today. Looking forward to doing it again soon. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.